Hello, everybody. Hi. So before we get started, I just want to do a quick survey of people. Some of these are somewhat personal questions, so if you don't feel comfortable responding, close your eyes and just imagine you're home alone, dreaming about me and Ron, as you always do. Raise your hand if you have kids that you know of. Okay. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much did your parents tell you about their finances? 1 being nothing, 5 you knew everything about their finances. Just raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5. Okay, for those of you who have kids, how much do you tell your kids about your finances? Okay, all right. How many of the parents have allowances, pay an allowance to the kids? Okay. If you could think of she can change her own diapers. Okay, so now if for the parents, what is the worst single word that someone could use to describe your kid? You just think of it, you don't have to shout it out loud. But there's one word you would hate for your kid, to be applied to your kid, what would that be? And with that thought, I'm going to introduce Ron Lieber, who is the Your Money columnist with the New York Times since 2008. Before then, he wrote for the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and Fortune. He won a business award in 2011 for your coverage on student loans. Ron Lieber, welcome to the Motley Fool. So, the question about the worst word being applied to your kid comes from your book. And if I understood it, your mother's response was average. Is that true? So that's either a lot of pressure or she wanted you to be below average.
Right. You know, that was the question was a thought exercise, and it began with a couple of phone calls I got right around the time that Occupy Wall Street was happening in New York. And there were some parents who'd seen some of the scattered things I'd written in the paper and online about kids and money and questions that kids asked about money. And they thought maybe I could come speak to their community and help them with some of the dissension there. But, you know, people who had more than average and people who had less, and the people who had more thought they were starting to feel sort of demonized by some of the conversations going on in the community. And the people with less felt like their noses were being rubbed in everybody else's affluence. And so they thought I could set everybody straight. And I tried to think about, or was trying to figure out what those people had in common. And I tried to think about the worst word that somebody might use to describe my own parenting that would be, sort of an indictment of what I had done. And the first thing that popped into my head was spoiled. Mostly because spoiled's a passive verb, right? Spoiled by whom? Right? Spoiled by you, spoiled by us. And so I tested that question out on a bunch of people I knew. And I heard a lot of spoiled, but I heard some mean, I heard some racist, and then I thought to ask my mom. Thankfully, she hadn't spoken that way when I was young. But when I put it to her, you know, I said, what's the single worst word that somebody could have ever used to describe the three of us? And she said, average.
Right, and then you were thinking about, okay, so what's the opposite of spoiled? And you actually couldn't come up with a good term, right? Because
yeah, that was how it started, right? I figured, okay, well, if spoiled is, you know, the thing that we do to them, if it's what we're trying to solve for or avoid, then what's the opposite of that, if that's what we're trying to achieve? And it wasn't a useful exercise at first, right? Because if you look in the thesaurus, you see fresh, which is good for meat.
Right. You want fresh kids.
Right. But not for kids. So
that's the name of the book, The Opposite of Spoiled.
Yeah, it became
because fresh isn't good enough.
Right. So it became this kind of quest, right, where like, okay, well, what are the values and virtues and character traits that add up to the opposite of spoiled, if that's what we're trying to achieve? And, you know, I made this list of things like modesty and thrift and prudence and generosity and gratitude and patience and perspective, curiosity about the world around you, you know, not sort of living in a bubble. And I looked at all those things and I thought, wow, you can use money and conversations about money to teach all of those things, right? So rather than just sort of close kids off when they ask these really hard questions about money, what if we did the inverse, right? What if we embraced those questions and used the answers to start conversations and rituals in our families that last for years, right? Where the end point of all of those conversations is one of those values or virtues that adds up to the opposite of spoiled. And I realized in that moment, before I went to talk to the parents about it, that these money conversations weren't just about numbers. They were actually about the sort of core of what we stand for and what we want to imprint on our kids. And while everybody sort of likes the idea of financial literacy in theory, a lot of people are sort of bored by it. But if you can convince people, and I think it's a reasonable proposition, if you can convince people that these conversations about money are actually conversations about values, then you bring way more people under the tent. And that was how this started.
You actually had looked at the work of James Fogarty, who's a psychologist who wrote a book called, it wasn't The Spoiled Child, but it was something along those lines. And the 4 characteristics that you had listed in the book from him were, number 1, few chores or other responsibilities. These are characteristics of the spoiled child. Mm-hmm. Not many rules that govern their behavior or schedules. 3, parents and others lavish them with time and assistance. And 4, a lot of material possessions. Mm-hmm. I talked about these with my wife, and we decided that our kids are half spoiled because they do get the time and the assistance. And of course, like every kid, they have more stuff than they need.
Yeah.
So it's tough not to do some of that stuff.
But it depends on how far you're going over the line, though, right? There's like a normal amount of time and attention, and then there's the sort of helicopter version of time and attention. The point at which you're not letting them fail, not letting them fall, the point at which you are finishing their sentences when they're struggling. Right. And intervening with their teachers and their friends, then I think you've gone too far. Same thing's true with the possessions. I mean, there are plenty of kids from really wealthy families who live in big houses and have all sorts of stuff and fly private, and they are incredibly gracious, exceedingly generous and totally lovely. And then there are kids who don't have very much at all, who are not gracious or grateful or thankful whatsoever. So it's not like people who are rich have a lock on spoiling their children, and it's also not the case that kids with very little can't be exceedingly spoiled. So much of it has to do, with gratitude and graciousness in addition to just the volume of stuff and privileges.
Right. Mm-hmm. When I asked the question beforehand, I think generally speaking, most people here didn't know a whole lot about their parents' finances. Mm-hmm. You're an advocate for being pretty open with your kids about money. So why is it that it's such a hard discussion to have, and what do you recommend people do with it? I have to say, one of the most interesting things that I read about the book was the guy, I think his name was Scott Parker. Mm-hmm. So this guy, his monthly income was $12,000. So he went to the bank and got out 12,000 $1 bills and brought them home to show the kids, this is what we get, and then this much goes to taxes, this much goes to the mortgage, and things like that. I thought that was quite something. So I'm going to need to borrow some money from you all afterwards. But go ahead. So why is it so hard?
Oh, it's hard for so many reasons, and I have a ton of sympathy with people who struggle with it. A big part of it is shame, and the shame exists on so many levels, right? It's the shame about the fact that you inherited a bunch of money. You didn't have to work for it, right? There may be shame about how you made the money. There may be shame about not having money or not having a job. There may even be shame about having plenty but just not having as much as most of the people who live near you in some fancy suburb or in some really affluent part of the city. Or in your private school community if you've sort of scraped to send your kids to one or if you're on scholarship at one. There may be shame about lack of knowledge of money, so you don't feel like you can talk about it with kids or answer their questions. There may be a lot of shame about how you spend it. I mean, one of the things that stands in the way of transparency in a lot of families is that the parents don't really want to be questioned about their choices because their choices kind of suck. Right? They've made indefensible choices about sort of how much they save or how little they give away or what they spend things on. And when the kids, particularly the older ones, start asking really pointed questions, the parents just want to shut them up. So, sort of starts there. And then I think that, there's a whole bunch of parents who think that, shielding kids from all of this money stuff is a form of protection, right? It's like, I don't want my kids to have to worry about this stuff at all, maybe because I worried about it when I was a kid, so I'm going to shield them from that. I want their lives to be carefree. I literally had somebody who is writing a book right now called Brilliant, The Science of Smart, admitted to me that she refuses to talk about money with her 6-year-old and her 9-year-old because she wants them to live in a bubble where money doesn't exist.
Can I join that bubble?
Right, and there's parents who's, the more we talk about this stuff, the more I answer their questions, the more I engage with them, the more they're going to be sizing people up on the basis of kind of who has what. They're going to be classifying people according to their social class. And, look, it's true that kids will do that, but kids are going to do that no matter what. I mean, to deny that money is a source of great power and mystery and not to honor their curiosity is just foolish, right? I mean, that's a bad word to use here.
As long as you said it in a lowercase way.
Yes.
That's good.
It just doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, it's their job to figure out how the world works. It's our job to tell them. And also, we're getting them ready for... Well, first of all, they're going to make what's probably the biggest financial decision of their lives at the age of 17. It's a 6-figure decision at minimum, or at least it seems that way until you find out what kind of financial aid you'll get. And what kind of world is this, by the way, where you get all of your choices like 4 weeks, if you're lucky, before you have to make this enormous choice. Maybe it's only 2 weeks or 1 week after you're done haggling with the financial aid office, right? So you're making this 6-figure decision, you're 17 years old, and you've had like a week or two to sort of sort out the numbers and even know what your choices are. I mean, it's madness, right? But it's the world that we live in. We got to get them ready for it. They're graduating into a world where they've had heaps of responsibility and risk, sort of thrown at them over the last 10 or 20 years. Everybody's responsible for their retirement. Everybody's got to buy health insurance now. You don't have to explain that in this room. We're in a world now where I think it's become increasingly clear, however you feel politically, that we have not taxed ourselves enough to pay for all of the promises that we've made to one another as a society. So one way or the other, higher taxes or people reaching in their pockets to pay for things that the government used to pay for, right? There's going to be more money coming out of their pocket. And so that's the world that we're raising them for. To shield them from that reality, to shield them from the knowledge, is not a form of protection. The best form of protection is to arm them with the information that they need to, get ready to make these big grown-up choices at ever earlier ages, right? So I just don't buy the silence. I think it's wrong. I think it's morally wrong.
So you have a 9-year-old daughter.
Another one coming.
Another one coming. Another 9-year-old coming. No, wait. That's not how it works, right?
That would be cool if it worked out that way. My wife, it would be a lot to carry around for that.
So how much does she know about your finances, and how many questions does she ask? Did she know you were writing this book and maybe get a little defensive? Like, I'm not spoiled. I don't know why you're writing this book.
It's a tricky thing. I mean, how many of you write about? How many? Who are the parents in the room? And do you ever write about your kids? Yeah. I mean, it's complicated, right? It's like, do you give them a choice in the matter, right? Do you give them veto power over what you write? Do you let them see it beforehand? Like all this, even if their names aren't mentioned, all of this sort of goes down on their permanent Google record unless it's behind a paywall. It's tricky, right? And I was worried, my wife was worried about turning our daughter into some kind of show pony or like putting pressure on her to make her think that she had to act one way or the other. But the book isn't really about her. I mean, the book is written as a sort of solemn promise, not just to her, but to all kids, that we're going to do better at this than our parents did, right? It's a generational manifesto in that way. It's sort of throwing down the gauntlet and say the silence must end. But it isn't so much about her. She appears a couple times, and the deal we made was that I would sit down with her and fact check, and we went over, every part of the book where she appears. We talked about it and made sure that she was comfortable with it. And that was how we did it.
So how do you recommend families do it, based on your experience or what you learned? Because you talk to a lot of families to figure out how they do it. Where you sit down as a family each month and go over the finances? Or is it, does every kid in the family knows everyone's salary? I mean, to what degree, logistically and informationally, are the kids involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it sort of in segments of childhood, right? So, they're going to start asking questions much earlier than you think. I started finding myself tongue-tied when I was 3. When she was 3, we were away one weekend, and I can't even remember where we were. Somebody had rented a house for the summer someplace, and we went out to hang out for the weekend. And, on the way back, she pipes up from the back seat. She said, "Why don't we have a summer house?" And I thought, whoa, well, we actually probably could, but we would have to make very different choices, right? Like, we wouldn't be saving any money. We might not have, we'd probably have to have a smaller apartment. We wouldn't go out to eat nearly as much. And so it wasn't so much about affordability as it was about choices, about trade-offs, right? And what are trade-offs, really, but just a different way of saying, these are the things that we value, and these are the things that we value. What's that except a different way of stating your values, right? And I thought, okay, here's this, and so what she's really doing back there, maybe she doesn't quite realize it, but what she's really doing when she pipes up and asks these questions is she wants to know what we stand for and why, right? Like, why we do what we do. She's doing her job, and my job is to answer her. I had no idea how to explain it. And so, I learned later, as I was doing the reporting, I heard from the mother of a 2-year-old. The 2-year-old said to her, "Why do you have to go to work when the other mommies don't go to work?" She didn't know how to answer that one either, right? So, whether you like it or not, they're coming at you with this stuff. But
I love the one question you have as a delaying tactic, which is to ask, "Why do you ask?"
Yeah.
Gives you like 10 seconds to think about it.
Right. Right. And quite often, especially when they're asking for big numbers that they won't understand because they're still too young, they're usually not, they're curious about the number because it represents something else that they're scared about or that they overheard. But, you have to start somewhere with this stuff, right? And, the most important thing for them to do is practice, right? So I think they should get allowance at a relatively early age, generally as soon as they start really wanting stuff. And as soon as they can count, as soon as you think they'll be responsible with it, you can start giving them $1 a week for every year that they've been alive. Usually, the time when I think it's really necessary to start is right after the tooth fairy comes for the first time, because then, they've got this money often for the first time that's theirs. And they realize very quickly that it's not enough to get whatever it is that they want, right? So then they want more, and some of them will try and pull their teeth out, their other teeth, to get more.
Or their siblings' teeth, whichever.
Right, yeah. So you don't want to do that. So that's usually a good time to start. And, then they can start counting and saving and, figuring out what's more important to them and what's less important to them. And so, you take it from there. You want them practicing with ever larger amounts of their own, for many years. And then, usually by the time the kids are 8, 9, 10 is when they start asking about how much their home costs, or they have the sense that different people make different amounts of money and they want to know what you make. To me, the answer to that question is we have every intention of telling you that someday. But not yet. You don't have enough, math skills yet, to add up the numbers that big. Or if they're math geniuses and they can already do that, you could say, look, you don't know enough about where our money goes, and it's going to take us several years to teach you all that. So we're going to do that for the next couple of years, and then when you're in high school, we can start talking about when you'll find out how much money we make, because we do want to tell you. In fact, we think you're entitled to that information. We think it's an information that's essential, and we want to tell you. But there's all this other stuff that you've got to learn first in order to earn your right to that information. And so, kind of all through middle school, you're breaking down the grocery store for them. Like, you can spend a whole year doing lessons in the grocery store, right? Even if you're buying groceries online, like, every choice is an amazing trip down the want-need continuum, right? Where you've got environmental issues, and you've got nutrition, and you've got social consciousness and responsibility, in addition to the money stuff, right? And so every one of those choices is an interesting trade-off. So you do that, and eventually they're going to Google their home address, right? They'll get the Zillow estimate. They'll think that you're whatever. I mean, if you have a townhouse in Old Town Alexandria, they may think you're a millionaire. At that point, you have to start explaining mortgages and the 5 or 6 bills you pay each month. You can give them the electric bill for a year and make them responsible for cutting it by 10% and give them the savings, right? So that's sort of a year of work that they can do. And eventually they understand all of the things that kind of add up to the take-home pay. And then by the time they're in high school, I think they're usually ready to get this information and hold on to it, only if they can pass the discretion test, right? Are they getting in trouble for gossiping, behind their friend's back? Or do they read their siblings' diaries? Or do they repeat private information that comes up in the family? And if they do, you've got to take some corrective action and say, look, you haven't proven yourself to be discreet enough to, get access to our family's financial information. But, once you do, we'll tell you. And I think, by the time they're seniors and making these huge decisions about college, they ought to know what it takes to have the life that they have now, whatever it is that you've been able to provide for them. I think they need to know it as they start making their own decisions about, what they're going to study and how much debt they're going to take on. And then there's a small matter that you have to tell them if you're filling out the FAFSA, because they've got to sign that form, right? So 70% people going to college take out student loans. Several percentage points more of those families fill out the FAFSA, even if they don't take out loans. So 3/4 of families are going to have to tell the kids during senior year anyway. But I think all of them probably should.
Speaking of tooth fairy, you actually asked your audience and people, what would you give, what amount? And you got quite a range of answers in terms of amount and just other things that people give instead of money.
Yeah, it was an interesting moment for us because we were caught unaware, and we did not have a plan in place. We had a couple hours to get it sorted out before everybody went to bed. So we posted on Facebook, and just dozens and dozens of reports came in from precincts all over the globe, and in the fancier northern suburbs of Chicago, there were reports of $20 bills, and somebody in Upper Westchester, outside of New York, reported that there was at least one kid who had gotten a $100 bill when he lost his first tooth. But somebody tipped us off that if you went to the subway MetroCard machines and you put a $5 bill in and bought a $2.50 card, it would give you 2 gold coins back, gold dollar coins with your card. And so that's what we ended up doing. We got her a couple of gold coins and put some, glitter like fairy dust, on the windowsill, and that was that. And that was fine. But afterwards, I heard about way more creative things that people did. Some friends of ours who both travel a lot for work, they now give their kids international currency. So so they can then go Google where it's from and look at pictures of that place, and they can sort of fantasize about going to spend it someday, and it gets them interested in helping the family, plan whatever eventual vacation they may be able to take outside the United States. So it's a great sort of tool for imagination. It doesn't just become about what they can spend, but actually where they can go, which is cool. But my favorite came from a couple that I know who live in Oakland, and they are Teach for America veterans, app developers, Stanford design graduates, and charter school founders between the two of them. So, try and top these two for creativity, right? So what they do is that every time one of their child loses a tooth, in return, they get a tooth from a different animal and it gets suspended in a glitter bath that's waiting for them when they wake up, and then a note that's written backwards that they have to hold up to the mirror to read that gives clues as to where the animal tooth, which animal the tooth came from.
And the kids enjoy this?
They seem to, as Randy, the dad explained it to me. He said, look, all they want is, they just want to be part of the conversation, right? They just want something to talk about that, makes them feel good about being a part of the chatter at school. And he said, rather than turn this into something that's like competitive, he said, why not, turn it into something that's creative? Yeah. And I thought that was a great point, particularly with something that's just so singularly focused on money, or that it has been traditionally. And, I like the way they made it about something different.
That's clever.
Yeah.
Now, if I understand correctly, you don't necessarily think that allowance should be tied to chores. So explain why you think kids should be entitled and lazy.
Yeah. So, just on a practical basis, right, if you give them money in exchange for doing their chores, there's going to come a point where they decide they have enough money. And then they're not going to want to do the chores that week or that month. And then you're sort of in a pickle, right? Because, you can stomp your foot and make them do the chores anyway, but that wasn't part of the deal. The deal wasn't you do chores no matter what. And if you let them go, then you're stuck doing the chores, right? So that's no fun. But look, here's another way to think about it, right? I think everybody in the house should do chores, and in the same way that the parents don't do chores, or don't get paid to do chores, they do it because that's what you do when you live in a household. I think it's just sort of a responsibility that comes with being a member of the family. And if you're looking for leverage, you can take away their privileges, whatever it is they like doing the most, as opposed to a couple of bucks a week if the chores don't get done. When I explain this to parents, they often think I'm a softie, but I actually think kids should do way more chores than they currently do. I think they're capable of a lot more than we give them credit for. We often don't have the patience to, teach them to do useful things, but I don't know. It's like, how many of you are watching MasterChef Junior? Or you know what it is? Yeah, so it's like all these 8 and 10 and 12-year-olds, competing in a cooking competition in front of Gordon Ramsay and, all of his sidekicks. And to me, the moral of that story is that they absolutely can cook dinner, and we should make them.
Call my children,
seriously. No, it's like, it's not that hard to like make an omelet or make pasta and make a salad. And we think they're going to cut their fingers off or burn the house down, but they're not.
I'm more likely to do that than my children. So.
Yeah, so I on the way down here, we're a little late getting the kiddos' camp situation figured out this summer. And it turns out now that there are all of these kind of fake MasterChef Junior camps in New York City, where the kids like come into camp in the morning and there's like the mystery basket of ingredients, and then they like teams of 4 like get together, in a commercial kitchen, and they have to figure out like how to make a whole meal out of the basket, and then that's what they do all day, and that's camp. Right, and then they come home and they do it again.
When you go to New York at a restaurant, just think about what you're eating. Yeah. So you hate piggy banks. Explain how you have your daughter apportion her allowance.
Yeah, well, I just think the metaphor is bad, right? It's like you're a hog, you're like your snout in the mud, you're piggish if you save your money. No. But also it's a design problem, it's a UX problem, really. Because you can't see through them, and the containers are too small, and you have to fold the money into little bits to get them in the slot, and nothing about it works, right? So we just use jars, like a jar like this that you would use you would pour like a box of Cheerios into, or a big bag of rice or flour, and put it on your kitchen or in your kitchen cabinets. And then our daughter, decorates it. And then it's much easier to put your hand in, take your hand out, and you can see the money grow when it's a big bin, and it can hold a year's worth of singles. And it makes her feel like she's accomplishing something.
And you have 3 jars, right?
3 jars, yeah. So I put them on the cover of the book for a reason. First of all, this is sort of a stand-in for the kind of budgeting that grown-ups do, right? Maybe we spend, I don't know, if we're relatively healthy, maybe we spend, 80% of what we make, and, we save 15, 17%. Most Americans give away, 2.5%, 3% of what they what they make. And so having kids divide money the same way begins to sort of lay the foundations for what an adult budget might look like. And you can have them divided any way you want. I mean, we do it, roughly in thirds. But different families do it in different ways, and sometimes families will match the money that kids keep in savings for a long time, or match the money that they give if they can keep it around for a while. So it does that for us. But I also like the way that the jars are kind of a stand-in for the values and the virtues and the character traits that we were talking about before, right? Spending is modesty. It's prudence, it's thrift, but it's not cheapness, or at least I don't like to think about it that way. I mean, I'm big into spending lavishly to the extent that I can afford to on the things that make me happiest, but I don't like doing mindless wallet dives into other, random stuff that just doesn't bring me any joy, all right? So there's some things that I'm willing to spend a lot of money on, and I never feel guilt about it. And there's some things that make me feel like an idiot, if I spend even like $5 on them, all right? And everybody's got their own list. But we've all, I think by now, seen the happiness research, right, that shows that, doing things is better than having things, right? Spending on experiences is much more powerful in terms of a happiness delivery vehicle than spending on stuff, on material possessions. And so, that's, I think, part of what we want to teach to our kids. So that's spend. Saving is just patience, right? Patience is a virtue, particularly in a world where things just kind of conspire against kids waiting, right? It's like you don't have to go to Blockbuster and sign up for the, new release anymore. You just push a button, right? You don't have to wait to watch the television commercials unless it's the first Monday night in April and you want to watch the final basketball game live, right? Even amusement parks now, right? These places that are literally custom built for kids to have fun. The kids with the most money, or the parents who are willing to spend their money, can buy line jumping passes, right? And it's you go to school, the most important rule is don't cut the line, right? And then you go into this park full of kids and you march just right to the front if you're willing to spend enough. So in all sorts of ways, kids don't have to wait as much as they used to. But when you're a grown-up, you have to wait, right? You have to wait for 50 years or whatever it is to retire. You have to wait for 30 years to pay your mortgage. And I don't know if any of the rest of you have noticed this. There was a source of mine that mentioned this to me a couple months ago. I put it in a column. It was one of the most profound things that anybody said to me in at least a year or two. She said, while nobody was looking, she said college all of a sudden became something that you spend a half a century paying for. And I thought, huh? And she said, the kid's born, and at age 0 you start the 529, but maybe you have 2 kids, and no matter what, unless you're really wealthy, you're just not going to be able to save, everything, right? And so, then you borrow when the kid's in school, the kid borrows, you borrow, you take out a plus loan, right? And then you can extend that loan to 25 or 30 years if you want. And all of a sudden you look back and you have spent 50 years paying for college, 50, half a century, right? You're gonna have to wait. You're gonna have to save. You're gonna have to be patient if you want to get through all of life's big expenses. And so the sooner we start teaching them that, having them practice that, I think the better. And then giving and helping people who have less than you is just another way to remind kids. I think about their own family history more than anything else, because almost certainly there was a point somewhere in the past where somebody helped you. Maybe somebody's helping you now in any number of ways. But it's a way to connect kids to a past where they may not have had as much. And it's a reminder them that they should be grateful for what they have now, and that in the same way that others have thrown the rope back for their family, their ancestors, it's their job to throw the rope back for other people too.
That's great. How much control do you think parents should have over the spending part? So if you're doing this, you got the savings, you got the giving, do you say to the kids, I don't care what you buy at this point? Or do you say, you want to buy this thing, but I have this feeling that in a day from now you're going to regret it. exercise any control over the spending, or it's just totally up to the kids?
Yeah, well, I think every family has their own banned item list, right? It's like no, pierced navels, no tattoos, no bare midriffs, right? Push-up bras.
I wore my full shirt today.
Yeah, it's like, right? Some families have laid down the line and said, like, not another Lego will cross this doorstep, right?
Right.
Whatever it is that's on your ban list, that's fine. Make it clear so the kids know. But beyond that, I think you should let them, spend on whatever they want, and especially on things that look like they're going to be wasteful, because, the sooner they feel that regret, the better. You want them screwing up in really big ways while they're still under your roof before it can mess up their credit score or cause them to get evicted or whatever, right? And you want to be able to talk to them about that regret. I think you should give them as much rope as you can, and ever larger amounts of money. I mean, I've talked to parents who have turned the whole clothing budget over to kids who are as young as 9 or 10, and just to kind of see what they would do with it, and inevitably they make all sorts of spectacular mistakes, and it's great fun to watch, right? Because it's like, then they have to bail themselves out.
They have to wear the midriff in the winter.
Yeah, right? Or it's like, you've gotten one pair of jeans because you wanted the fancy jeans, and that was all you could afford, and then you, split them down the middle because you've grown really fast in the course of 4 or 5 months, and, then you've got to figure out what to do about that. And, hopefully the parents are not bailing those kids out, and, they're letting them learn the lesson. So,
what about investing some of that savings? Do you think that's important, or is that a lesson later on in life?
Yeah, I think, for kids who are interested in it, I think it's a terrific idea. Quite often it starts with kids who have an intense amount of curiosity about how things get made, or they're particularly obsessed with a favorite restaurant or a favorite theme park or a favorite toy, and it sort of goes from there. I don't know if I would, force it on kids who are not necessarily showing any interest in it, but, I think it can only help for kids who want to play around with individual stocks. I mean, one of the things I really like about it is that it teaches them the concept of risk. There are not a lot of ways for kids to learn about risk, at least through the standard, educational curriculum. And so, we parents have to sort of gin stuff up for them. But the problem is we don't want them to do it because we don't want them taking any risks, right? Because we're scared to death that they'll, harm themselves. This is something that's actually useful. I wish there were more ways for kids to understand the concept of, economic loss, at least without their families going through it, which happens to many families. But I think if more kids understood kind of downside risks, there might be fewer of them taking on absurd amounts of undergraduate student loan debt to go to some third-tier private college, instead of the flagship state university.
You talk a little bit in the book about different things that parents do in terms of paying interest, matching contributions. There was an inconvenience tax. I thought that was interesting. So why don't you explain some of those?
Sure. I mean, parents put all sorts of incentives in place, which, makes perfect sense to me because, employers do it in the workplace, right? So that is, part of what life is like in the real world. I mean, our government, puts incentives in place through tax breaks of various sorts. So there are parents who will match savings in various ways, and some parents will put bonuses into place that depend on how long the kid has saved the money. So rewarding longer periods of patience with kind of ever larger amounts of bonuses, right? So if you manage to keep money if there's money in your save jar, if you haven't touched your save jar in 3 months, you get X. But if you haven't touched it in 6 months, you get X plus Y. And if you haven't touched it in 12 months, you get X plus Y plus Z. So, it encourages them not, to raid the kitty, in essence. So, you can do all sorts of things there. The penalties, I like less. There's some parents who, kind of hand them allowance money over to the kids and then immediately take some back to try and teach them about the concept of taxes. There's another family I met recently that does something cool. They have a fourth jar for taxes, and that tax money gets collected each year, and then they spend it on something really awesome when the family is on vacation. So that works for me. Penalties I'm less fond of, although that inconvenience tax was pretty awesome. Basically, the way that worked, it was a family actually right around here, Northern Virginia, and the two siblings, and the younger boy was constantly borrowing his older sister's, water bottles and lunch boxes, and he was constantly losing stuff. So they decided to put an inconvenience tax into place. Not only did he have to replace the item when it disappeared, but he would have to pay extra for however many days his sister was inconvenienced, and that money went to her. And he really did not like paying her the tax, and so very quickly he got his act into shape.
So one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. But because you got the award covering student loans, we talked a little bit about college, and in the book you actually talked about mandatory tuition savings and things like that. So what's your take on how much kids should contribute to their college educations, how much even veto power parents should have over which schools they go to?
Yeah, so there's a family I profiled in the book that sits down with each of their kids as they're starting freshman year in high school and said to them, we have enough money right now to pay for you to go to college any place that you want, but we're going to require that you pay for the first semester of tuition yourself. So they give them plenty of warning. They've got basically 4 summers to earn it. The last kid graduated, I think, a year ago. They all went to private colleges. They weren't scared away by this, and they didn't all kind of decide to just go to the SUNY school to save themselves. Would have been more than a 50% savings. They all went to private colleges, and the amount ended up ranging between like $15,000 and $22,000 that they had to make. But they did it. They worked 50, 60, 70 hours a week each and every summer. They scooped ice cream, and they umpired softball games, and they scrubbed toilets at the beach, and they tutored, and then eventually they all got their lifeguard certifications. And that's a slightly higher paying job than a lot of other summer jobs that kids can get. And they worked just enough to make all of that money, and they handed it over to their parents, and that was how it went down. Some people find that to be sort of an impossible task, or they want their kids doing enrichment or traveling with the family during the summer, but make them pay for something, right? Make them pay for their all of their spending money in college, in the very least. Just because I think it's important that they have some skin in the game, right? That I think is a good thing to do with all kids who are going to college. A trickier question, right, comes down to like how much will you let them borrow? Because it's ultimately up to you, right? Beyond the federal loan limits, which are whatever they are, $32,000, $33,000, over the course of an undergraduate education. If they want to go to a private college or even a public college, and you don't have enough, and they want to take on a private debt, from a private lender that's not the federal government. In most cases these days, you've got to get a cosigner, and so you literally have veto power there. So it becomes a very tricky conversation. Kind of how much debt is too much, and I don't think we have come up with a reasonable answer to that question yet, because there's a lot of rules of thumb out there that say, well, don't borrow more than whatever your starting salary is going to be. How on earth are you going to know what that is, right? At 18 or even at 20 or even at the beginning of your senior year in college, you have no way of knowing how the economy is going to turn or whether you're going to be attractive to employers. It's really, really difficult. So, I don't think we have a good answer to that question yet. I mean, to me, it's just better to be safe than sorry and to avoid the private student loan debt altogether, just because it doesn't come with the same protections that the federal student loan debt comes with, like this the income-based repayment program. Some of you may be in it. No matter how little you're earning, you only have to pay what you can afford to pay. But that's not the case with these loans that come from Sally Mae and the banks. So.